March 17, 1944. Aero 342 hours, South Pacific, 140 miles northeast of Rabaul. Walter Kowalski was finishing the evening meal service when the first alarm sounded. The USS Hendricks, a Fletcher-class destroyer built in 1942, had become his floating home for exactly 14 months. He knew every corner of her galley, knew which oven burned hotter on the left side, knew that the coffee always tasted metallic at Earth's 300 hours because the pipes needed flushing, knew the faces of 312 men who came to eat here 3 times a day. He was 34 years old, too old for war, too old to have been drafted from a Chicago bakery where he'd worked since before America even entered the fight. But the Army didn't care about age. It cared about warm bodies and full stomachs, and Walter was good at providing both. The alarm changed everything. Battle stations! A voice crackled through the loudspeaker, cutting through the darkness like a knife. Walter's hands froze mid-motion. His coffee pot hung suspended in the air. 3 decks below, in the galley he'd left moments ago, flames erupted from a ruptured pipe. He didn't know it yet. Didn't know that the Japanese had located them again. For the 3rd consecutive night, the night sky erupted. From the deck, the anti-aircraft guns roared to life. Not a single shot, not 2. A thunderous cascade of 40mm and 20mm rounds reaching skyward like an inverted rain of fire. The USS Hendricks lurched hard to port. Walter stumbled, catching himself against a bulkhead, the metal warm and slick with condensation. Lieutenant Commander James Hayes burst onto the bridge. 43 years old, Navy man since 1928. He'd fought at Coral Sea, seen Pearl Harbor's aftermath, thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. Bogies bearing 270. Multiple contacts closing fast. The radar operator's voice was steady, professional, but Hayes heard the fear underneath. After 3 nights of this, fear was becoming familiar. Range, Hayes demanded. 30 nautical miles and closing. Sir, they're tracking us. Every time we activate the scope, they come. Hayes understood immediately. The Japanese weren't stumbling upon them in the darkness. They were following the radar signal like a hound following a scent. The very technology designed to protect the USS Hendricks was like a neon sign screaming, "Shoot here," across the night. He wasn't the first to recognize the problem. He was the 1,000th to face it. In Washington, Harvard University physicists had spent months and $47,000 in government contracts developing a radar jamming counter solution. They'd submitted their reports with confidence. The Navy had filed them away. MIT had assembled their finest minds. Oscilloscopes, circuit boards. A brilliant engineer named Dr. Lawrence Braddock, who'd literally written the textbook on electromagnetic interference. Their project consumed $89,000 and months of classified research. The result? Elegant on paper, useless in practice. Then there was Naval Research Laboratory. They'd thrown everything at it. $3.7 million. The best radar specialists America could produce. Projects so secret they existed in numbered file folders without proper titles. And nothing, absolutely nothing, had worked. Because the problem wasn't theoretical. It was existential. You needed radar to see. But using radar meant the enemy could see you coming. The math was impossible. The choice was between certain death and probable death, between being blind or being visible. 4 American destroyers had already paid the price for this paradox. USS O'Brien, USS Tucker, USS Strong, USS Gwynn, gone, along with 240 men who'd never come home to their mothers. Now the radar operator had his scope lit up again. Now Japanese Zero pilots were converging on their position like wolves recognizing the musk of wounded prey. Walter emerged onto the weather deck without really remembering how he'd gotten there. Years in the galley had attuned him to the rhythm of the ship. His body knew the sound of trouble. His feet had carried him topside before his mind had finished processing the alarm. What he saw next was burned forever into his memory. The sky wasn't sky anymore. It was fire. Japanese aircraft, he could count 4, maybe 5 silhouettes against the phosphorus glow, descended in a coordinated attack pattern, precise, rehearsed, hungry. The Hendricks guns tracked them with desperate accuracy. 40mm rounds carved bright lines across the darkness. A Zero broke formation, smoke trailing from its starboard wing. The pilot was good though. He banked hard, diving lower, below the effective range of the ship's main guns. Incoming! Starboard side. 30 seconds, someone screamed. Walter felt it before he saw it. A pressure change, a tightness in the air that meant death was moving through it. The bomb fell like a black teardrop against the phosphorus glow. He watched it descend, watched the impact with the starboard side, watched the steel hull crumple like tin foil, watched his ship, his home of 14 months, convulse as if struck by an invisible fist. The blast threw him backward, his head connected with the deck rail. Stars exploded in his vision. Pain bloomed like flowers made of fire. When he finally focused his eyes again, he could see the damage. A hole in the hull, flames licking upward from the damaged control compartment, but the ship stayed afloat. Through the smoke and chaos and screaming, Walter's mind worked on a single impossible problem. Not the tactical problem, not the immediate danger, but the deeper question that had no answer. How do you send a signal without broadcasting your position? How do you be seen while remaining invisible? The question would haunt him for the next 6 days. March 23, 1944, 6 days later, the damage control teams had sealed the worst of the wounds. The USS Hendricks limped toward the naval base at Guadalcanal for repairs. Temporary patches that would hold just long enough to get her back to fighting condition. The Navy didn't care about comfort. It cared about firepower, speed, and the ability to launch ordnance at the enemy. Walter stood in the galley, staring at his ice cream machine. It was broken. That had happened during the attack. The concussion had torn it from its moorings. One of the support struts had bent at an impossible angle. The whole apparatus hung there like a crippled animal, leaking sweet vanilla-scented coolant onto the deck. Normally, he would have filed a report. The machine would have been shipped stateside for repair, or junked. In wartime, replacement was often cheaper than restoration, but Walter had nothing else to do. The ship was in port. Most of the crew was on shore leave, and his hands that had kneaded dough for 34 years before the war, hands that had scrambled eggs for breakfast, hands that had served chocolate cake to men who would never come home, needed something to do besides shake. He'd been below decks when the second bomb hit. He'd felt the ship convulse like an animal under a whip, heard the steel groan in agony. He didn't remember much after that, just the cold of the deck plating against his face, the taste of blood that might have been his, the sound of the klaxon like the screaming of 1,000 seabirds. Now, with tools he'd borrowed from the engineering compartment, he began to disassemble the machine. The ice cream mixer worked on a simple principle. Electric motor connected to a central drive shaft. The shaft rotated continuously. The rotation was transmitted through a series of gears and sprockets to the freezing coils that circled the main chamber. Round and round, constant motion. The friction created by the rotating mechanism created the cold that turned liquid into frozen dessert. But Walter noticed something odd as he worked. The bent support strut had created an irregularity in the drive transmission. Where the machinery should have engaged smoothly, gear tooth meeting gear tooth in synchronized, predictable intervals, now there was a catch, a hesitation. Every 5th or 6th revolution, the gears would slip slightly out of phase. The motor would strain for just a fraction of a second. Then it would re-engage. On-off, 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 like a stammer, like a signal being interrupted and retransmitted. Walter sat back on his heels, the wrench hanging loose in his hand. His mind, which hadn't thought about anything more complex than meal schedules in 6 days of constant nightmares, suddenly locked onto the problem like a radar operator locking onto a target. What if you didn't want the signal to be continuous? He climbed topside, the question burning in his skull like a fever. The naval base was built around a shallow lagoon ringed by coral reefs. Enormous destroyers and cruisers were tied up at makeshift piers, supply ships, repair vessels. The whole machinery of naval warfare stretched across the blue water like a mechanical garden. He found Eddie Vasquez in the radio compartment. Eddie was the USS Hendricks' radio man, 26 years old, from Puerto Rico via the Bronx, the kind of man who could coax music from a broken wireless set and make mathematics sing through a telegraph key. He and Walter played chess sometimes, 3 decks below, in the berthing compartment where off-duty sailors tried to forget about the war. "I got an idea," Walter said. Just like that, no preamble. Eddie looked up from the repair manual he was reading. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, a shift in the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. This was not a topic for idle conversation. This was locked down military business, classified, above both their pay grades. "Come on," Walter said quietly. "We can talk in the machine shop." Nobody goes there after 1,700 hours. What Walter explained, stumbling over technical terms he barely understood, gesturing with his hands to try to make visible the idea burning in his brain, was radical. Impossible on the surface, elegant underneath. The problem with radar was that it broadcast constantly, a continuous signal, a lighthouse beam rotating endlessly through the night, advertising your position to anyone with a receiver tuned to the right frequency. The enemy just had to home in on that beam like a moth to flame. But what if the beam wasn't continuous? What if instead of broadcasting all the time, the radar turned itself off and on? Pulsed, transmitted for a fraction of a second, then fell silent. Transmitted again, fell silent. Over and over so quickly that it achieved continuous coverage of its effective range, but in fractured, interrupted bursts. The Japanese can track a continuous signal, Walter said, his hands moving like he was painting pictures in the air. But if the signal is broken up, stuttering, their receivers might not be able to lock onto it. It's like trying to follow a flashlight beam in the fog. You can follow a steady light, but a blinking light, that's harder. Your eye loses it. Your instruments lose it. Eddie stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the porthole, staring out at the Pacific without seeing it. "Where are you getting this?" Eddie finally asked. "My ice cream machine," Walter said. He explained it then. The broken strut, the rhythmic engagement and disengagement, the on-off pattern that had seemed like a defect but was actually… what? A solution. An epiphany. Walter still wasn't entirely sure himself. "It's mechanical," Walter continued, "but it's the same principle. You're interrupting the flow, creating gaps, and in those gaps the signal becomes invisible, or at least harder to see." Eddie turned to face him. His face was troubled, conflicted. "The Navy would need to redesign the whole system," Eddie said slowly. "New circuits, new transmitters. It would take months, maybe years. It would need engineers. Real engineers, PhD types from MIT or Bell Labs, or… What if it didn't?" Walter interrupted. "What if you could jury-rig it? Add a mechanical interrupter to the existing system, something that turns the transmission on and off." "Like what?" Walter thought about the ice cream machine, about the battered support strut and the irregular motion it produced, about how something broken could become something functional if you looked at it from the right angle. "Like a cam," Walter said. "A rotating cam with an off-center profile. You mount it on the drive shaft. As it rotates, it pushes against a switch. Opens circuit, closes circuit, opens, closes. You adjust the shape of the cam and the rotation speed. You can create any pattern you want." Eddie continued pacing, his mind visibly working through the implications. Outside the radio room, the South Pacific sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the water the color of blood and gold. Somewhere out there, in that beautiful evening light, Japanese pilots were probably preparing for another night mission, preparing to hunt whatever American ships were foolish enough to light up their radars. "If this doesn't work," Eddie said slowly, "we could make things worse. We could create a system that's even easier to track. And if Command found out we'd modified a radar system without authorization…" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Court-martial, execution, firing squad at dawn." "I know," Walter said quietly. "Why are you telling me this, Walter? Why me?" Walter looked at his hands, hands that had been making bread for most of his adult life, hands that were shaking now, but not from fear, from certainty, from the absolute conviction that he'd seen something true. "Because you're smart enough to understand," Walter said. "Because you can make it work. And because I can't do this alone." Eddie walked to the window again. He stared out at the USS Hendricks, sitting at her berth, her starboard side still scarred from the bomb. 3 days later, and they'd already received orders for another patrol, another night, another activation of the radar that had become not a tool, but a death sentence. "The shops close at 1900 hours, Eddie said finally. "After that, it's just the two of us and the maintenance crew from engineering. They won't ask questions if we're working on the ice cream machine. Is that a yes?" Eddie turned to face him directly. His jaw was set. His eyes were hard. The look of a man who just decided to cross a line he could never uncross. "That's a yes, because in 2 weeks we're going back out. And I'm not ready to die for a problem that can be solved." March 24th, March 31st, 1944. The build. They worked in the machine shop at night. always at night, always after 1900 hours when the maintenance crews cleared out and the USS Hendricks settled into the rhythms of a ship at rest. The work was meticulous, dangerous. Eddie brought schematics rolled up inside a tool bag, diagrams he'd sketched from memory based on his training. He'd studied these systems for months. He knew the theory. What he didn't know was whether anyone actually believed in the theory outside of classrooms. Walter brought the cam. He'd spent 3 days machining it from a piece of brass salvaged from the engine room. It was beautiful in its simplicity, an off-center wheel about 3 inches in diameter, carefully shaped so that as it rotated, it would create a periodic interruption. On-off, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the fundamental rhythm of interruption and resumption. They worked silently, communicating mostly through gestures and the occasional whispered instruction. A radio man and a cook, working by the light of a single hooded lamp, trying to solve a problem that had defeated the best minds in America. On the 3rd night, Eddie's hands began to shake so badly he had to set down the soldering iron. "What if it doesn't work?" he whispered. "Then we've wasted a week," Walter replied, not looking up from the relay he was adjusting. "If it doesn't work, it could make things worse. It could make the signal even easier to track. Signal stronger, more coherent. The Japanese would lock onto it like a beacon." Walter set down his tools. He looked at Eddie in the dim light. The radio man's face was thin, haunted. This was a man who'd spent months listening to radio frequencies, hearing the coded transmissions of dying ships, who'd cataloged in his own mind the specific patterns of distress calls, who knew, with intimate precision, exactly how many men had died because this problem remained unsolved. "Tell me you believe in this," Eddie said. "Tell me you know it will work." "I can't," Walter said quietly. "I don't know. Nobody knows. That's why we're doing it." Eddie laughed, a short brittle sound in the darkness that might have been a sob. "That's insane," he said. "Yes," Walter agreed. "It is." They kept working. By March 27th, the system was nearly complete. The cam and relay apparatus had been carefully integrated into the USS Hendricks radar console without removing any original components. It looked like jury-rigged garbage, exactly the kind of maintenance work a harried radio man might perform. But Eddie had made damn sure it would be invisible to any inspector who didn't know exactly what they were looking for. The final phase was the delicate soldering of relay contacts. One mistake, one tiny bridge of solder in the wrong place, and the whole system would fail. Or worse, it would do something unpredictable, something catastrophic. Walter watched Eddie's hands as he worked. They were no longer shaking. Now they were steady, surgical, the hands of a man who'd crossed through fear into something else, certainty maybe, or resignation, the acceptance of consequence. "It's done," Eddie whispered on March 30th at 0300 hours. They sat in the darkness of the machine shop, looking at what they'd built. It didn't look like much. It looked like nothing. It looked like the end of everything, or the beginning of something. There was no way to know which. "We can't test it without activating the radar," Eddie said. "And we can't activate the radar without drawing attention." "When do we go back to sea?" Walter asked. "Tonight, 2,000 hours. New orders from Admiral Nimitz. Heavier escort routes, more dangerous waters." Walter nodded. He'd heard the scuttlebutt in the galley. 4 ships reassigned, the USS Hendricks among them. "Does it work?" Eddie continued. "We have no idea. We've never tested it under load. We've never activated it in a combat situation. For all we know, it's going to light up the console like a fireworks display and broadcast our position to every Japanese pilot within 200 miles. "Can we remove it?" Walter asked. Eddie shook his head. "Not safely. Not in the time we have. And if we try and get discovered..." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what discovery would mean. "Court-martial, execution, firing squad at dawn. Then we go with it," Walter said. That evening, as the USS Hendricks pulled away from Guadalcanal with its cargo of hope and terror, Walter stood in the galley preparing the evening meal. Chicken stew. The meat was tough, the vegetables soft from overcooking, the broth undersalted, but 312 men needed to eat. War didn't pause for uncertainty or doubt. He was ladling stew into bowls when the general quarters alarm sounded. Not a drill. The real thing. The depth charges on the deck above confirmed it. "Japanese patrol," Eddie said quietly, appearing in the galley doorway. 30 miles out, bearing 280. "They're coming for us." This was the moment. This was when everything would either validate their gamble or condemn them all. Eddie disappeared toward the radio compartment. Walter continued serving stew. The anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their stations. The ship surged with acceleration. Somewhere above, Captain Anderson was ordering evasive maneuvers. Somewhere below, Eddie was about to activate a system that might save them or kill them all. Walter handed a bowl to Petty Officer Martinez. The man's hands were shaking as he took it. "We'll be okay," Walter said. He didn't know that. He had no reason to believe it, but the men needed to hear it. The next 7 minutes existed outside of time. They were somehow both infinitely long and compressed into a single heartbeat. Walter heard the ship's engines screaming as they pushed toward maximum RPM, heard the captain's voice over the loudspeaker, heard something else, a strange electrical hum from somewhere deep in the vessel's systems. Then, crackling through the internal circuit, Eddie's voice. "Radar is active. Cam is rotating. Signal is—" "Walter, it's fragmenting. It's pulsing exactly like you said, breaking up the transmission into scattered pieces. Like a constellation instead of a lighthouse beam. We're showing up on scope like optical noise, like weather interference, like ghost images." Walter set down his ladle. The minutes stretched. At 2325 hours, the Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon, 2 zeros flying in formation. They passed directly over the USS Hendricks at 2340 hours, searching for the radar signature they knew existed. But what they found instead was a phantom, a ghost, a signal that stuttered and interrupted and refused to cohere into anything their receivers could lock onto. By 2345 hours, they'd moved on, hunting for clearer prey. Hunting for ships that broadcasted their position in continuous, readable signals. The USS Hendricks had become invisible. Walter finished serving stew April 3rd, May 15th, 1944. Deployment and aftermath. The telegraph from Admiral Mitcher's office arrived at 600 hours on April 5th, 72 hours after the USS Hendricks' successful evasion of the Japanese patrol. Walter was serving breakfast when Eddie appeared in the galley, his face pale, his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the construction phase. Eddie held a piece of paper, official Navy letterhead. He didn't need to speak. Walter knew. 47 destroyers were being retrofitted with the system. 47. Not a test, not a trial run. A full-scale deployment of what Walter and Eddie had built in a machine shop under cover of darkness. Within 2 weeks, every radar-equipped destroyer in Task Force 58 had been modified. The modifications were listed in official reports as routine maintenance upgrades. No names were attached, no credit given, no acknowledgement of the 2 men who'd spent 7 nights building something that the Navy's finest minds had said was impossible. The USS Hendricks led the way. Between April 3rd and May 15th, the ship participated in 6 major engagements, 6 opportunities for Japanese aircraft to find them, 6 opportunities for the system to fail. It didn't fail once. The metrics were stark. Before the deployment of Walter and Eddie's invention, Task Force 58 had been losing an average of 1.2 ships per week to radar-guided attacks. After April 3rd, that number dropped to 0. Not one destroyer sunk by Japanese aircraft that could lock on to radar signatures. In 6 weeks, 47 ships conducted operations with 0 losses attributable to radar tracking. 0. In the Pacific Theater, where death was the currency of war, 0 was a miracle. But Walter didn't know any of this. He continued serving breakfast, continued preparing lunch, continued standing at his post in the galley, doing the work that nobody noticed, the work that kept men alive through the simple act of feeding them. The captain never mentioned it. The Admiral's office sent a single commendation to the USS Hendricks captain, not to Eddie Vasquez or Walter Kowalski by name, but to the ship as a unit. The captain read it aloud during a ship-wide assembly on May 15th, then filed it away. By June, new orders had arrived. The system was being deployed across the entire Pacific Fleet. Every radar-equipped vessel from the Philippines to Samoa was being retrofitted with the Walter Kowalski modification. Still no names. Still no credit. Chicago, Illinois. November 1984. 40 years later, Walter Kowalski was 74 years old. His bakery had become a Chicago institution. Tourists knew about it. Food critics wrote about it. Every major restaurant in the city served his bread and pastries. He'd never married, never had children of his own. His life had been flour and yeast and the quiet satisfaction of feeding people. He was closing the shop. It was 2300 hours, the same time he'd worked in the galley of the USS Hendricks, when 3 naval officers walked through the door. They were young, probably in their 20s. They wore uniforms from the Naval Research Laboratory. "Mr. Kowalski?" the senior officer asked. "Yes. My name is Commander James Patterson. I oversee advanced radar systems development for the Navy. I wanted to meet you." Walter set down his apron. He felt something shift inside his chest. 40 years. It had been 40 years. "We've been doing historical research," Patterson continued. "Declassified documents, interviews with surviving officers from the Pacific Fleet. We've traced the pulse transmission radar modification back to you and Radio Man First Class Edward Vasquez." "I see," Walter said. "The system you invented, or modified, I should say, saved an estimated 1,470 lives during its first 6 weeks of deployment. Across the entire fleet, over the course of the war, it saved between 4,000 and 5,000 lives." Walter didn't say anything. He was listening to the sound of the oven cooling, the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of his ordinary life. "I came here to ask if you'd be willing to speak with us about how the system was developed. We want to include your story in an official history we're preparing." "No," Walter said. Patterson looked startled. "Sir, I understand you may have concerns about—" "It's not about concerns," Walter said. "It's about privacy. Eddie and I did what needed doing. We didn't do it for recognition. We did it because 312 men were aboard a ship and they deserved to come home. Some of them did, some of them didn't later on. But not because of radar. Mr. Kowalski, the Navy can acknowledge it or not. It doesn't matter. The radar system works. The men who deployed it knew what it was. That's enough." Patterson stood there, clearly struggling with what to say. Then he pulled out a photograph, a simple piece of paper with handwriting on the back. "There's something else," Patterson continued. "We've been tracking something remarkable. The men who were saved by the system, sailors who served on those 47 destroyers. We've been finding their descendants." He placed the photograph on the counter. It showed 3 generations: grandparents, parents, children, smiling, alive. "This family," Patterson said. "The grandfather served on the USS South Dakota. He was 19 years old when the war ended. He made it home because of what you built. He married a schoolteacher, had 4 children. One of his daughters became a doctor at Johns Hopkins. She saved maybe 3,000 lives in her career. His grandson is a priest in Honduras, runs an orphanage. His great-granddaughter just got accepted to Harvard Medical School." Patterson pulled out another photograph, then another, then a folder, thick with images, families, generations. "We found thousands of living people," Patterson said. "Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. They exist because of what you and Radio Man Vasquez built in the dark. Every single one of them owes their life, their entire existence, to 47 nights of work in a machine shop." Walter stared at the photographs, at the faces of people who would never have existed if the system had failed, if they'd been caught, if they'd decided the risk was too great. "Their oldest daughter is a judge," Patterson continued, pointing to another photo. "She's sentenced 187 criminals. She's protected the community. The grandson of another sailor. His family came from the USS Indianapolis. He invented a blood pressure monitor. It's been used in 200,000 medical procedures. How many of those people would have died without it?" Walter couldn't speak. "The system," Patterson said finally. "Does it still work?" "Actually, yes," Patterson said. "Modern radar systems use principles that trace directly back to your modification. Everything from naval vessels to airport traffic control to weather forecasting, they all use variations of pulsed transmission theory. Your work is still saving lives, every single day, right now, as we speak." Walter walked to the window. He looked out at the Chicago street, at the thousands of people walking past his bakery, at the ordinary city, at the lives extending forward in unbroken chains, all because of a machine shop and 2 men working in the dark. November 12th, 1995, Walter Kowalski died at home in Chicago at 23:15 hours. He was 85 years old. His heart simply stopped while he was reading in his favorite chair. At his funeral, there were people from all over the country: former Navy officers, radar engineers, historians, people whose parents or grandparents had served aboard radar-equipped destroyers. One woman approached Walter's niece during the reception. She was in her 60s with kind eyes and a photograph in her hand. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "My father served on the USS South Dakota. He was 19 years old when the war ended. He made it home because of your uncle, because of his invention. He married, had 4 children. I'm the oldest. I became a teacher. I've taught over 2,000 students across 40 years. Some of them have gone on to remarkable things. Doctors, engineers, artists, parents, just ordinary people living ordinary lives." She paused, studying the photograph. "It's hard to know how far a kindness travels," she said. "My father died 5 years ago, but because he came home, I exist. And so do his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It's a kind of immortality, isn't it? Not recognition, not fame, just continuation. Just being alive to pass life forward." 2024. 80 years later, the USS Hendricks was decommissioned in 1968. She was broken up for scrap metal in 1971. Of her original crew of 312, only a handful remain alive, but their descendants number in the thousands. Among them, doctors and teachers, engineers and scientists, artists and parents, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Each one owes their existence to Walter Kowalski's broken ice cream machine and Eddie Vasquez's willingness to risk everything on an idea that nobody believed in. The pulse transmission radar system is no longer called the Kowalski modification. It's just called radar now. Nobody remembers where it came from. The history textbooks don't mention the names. The Navy records are filed away in archives that almost nobody visits. But somewhere in the infrastructure of modern life, in the systems that guide ships safely through storms, that help doctors detect tumors before they become lethal, that keep planes from colliding in the sky, Walter's system is still working, still saving lives, still proving that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or committees, but from a cook and a radio man standing in the dark, asking, "What if?"